I have to accept that I was somewhat skeptical of this type of paranormal things. When friends and my family talked about it, I lost total interest in the conversation. However, after what happened the other night, my perception about paranormal events change. I'll introduce myself. My name is John. I will reserve the name of where I work and its address. This in order to protect the place where everything happened. Whenever I have to go to work, I can't find a good place to park, so I have to drive a few blocks and leave the car parked next to a cemetery. During the day, you could say that things are as normal as one could imagine. However, when it gets dark and I leave work late, walking in front of the cemetery is usually somewhat disturbing. I know that I had told you that I did not believe in this type of situation, but to be honest, the feeling of being at night next to the cemetery is always disturbing. It was already very late. I had piled up a lot of work at the office, and I was just leaving when it was almost midnight. As I walked next to the cemetery, I tried not to look up. I had the strange feeling that I would meet someone there. The last thing I wanted was to see a person walking among the graves so late. It was at that moment that I could hear someone bouncing a ball inside the cemetery. It was inevitable to turn around. I couldn't see anything, but that sound could be heard clearly. I was almost at my car, so I started looking for the keys in my portfolio. And as I did so, I looked for who could be playing with a ball so late at night. And in the distance, in front of a tomb, I could see a child standing in front of a chapel. I had the feeling that this was not normal, seeing a child alone and in the dark in the middle of the cemetery. I wanted to talk to him, but in the blink of an eye, I lost sight of him. I finally managed to find my keys, opened my car and prepared to leave there. The next day, I had to leave the car right at the gate of the cemetery, and although it was already daylight, I could feel that chilling sensation. I promised myself to leave early so I wouldn't run into anything strange. Throughout the day, I forgot the event of the previous night due to all the work I had on me, which caused me to leave my office late again. I prepared the keys before leaving so I wouldn't have to look for them. I put on my headphones so I wouldn't be distracted and headed towards my car. It wasn't as late as the night before, but at the time there weren't any people around. But right in front of the cemetery gate and on one side of my car, there was a boy bouncing a ball. My first impression was that it was already quite late for a child to be playing alone in that place. "What are you doing here so late, kid?" I asked. But he didn't answer me. I could see that his ears were full of dirt. I imagined that perhaps he had fallen because I could also see his scraped elbows and scratched forehead. "May I help you?" I asked him, and the boy stopped bouncing the ball. Then he raised his hand and pointed into the graveyard. "I lost something. Can you help me look for it?" He told me. I could see his eyes were haggard. The child was quite pale. "I just can't go in there," I told him, all nervous. But he repeated to me that something had been lost in there, and he headed towards the cemetery. I completely lost sight of him in the darkness. Maybe it was wrong of me, but I decided to ignore it and leave it there, so I headed home. While I was driving, I couldn't stop thinking about the child, whether it was better to leave him there or whether I had to go back to help him. I wasn't far from home. I was almost there. I could feel quite cold in the car. It was already autumn and it was almost December, so it seemed normal to me that the temperature dropped so quickly, and that moment while I was putting on my sweater at a red light, I could sense that someone was watching me. It was a strange feeling that one gets to feel that you are not alone. I looked in the rearview mirror, and the face of a child was watching me attentively, and he said to me at the same time that he looked me in the eyes.
"Hello."
I hit the brakes. I was scared when I saw the child, but when I looked for him in the back seat, I didn't see him. I was sure I had seen the boy. I still had the sound of his voice in my head. I wasn't wrong. When I got home, I thought that I still felt tired, and I had to stop thinking about the situation. My head had played a bad joke on me because of so much stress at work, and I had to rest. My wife was already asleep. I kissed her on the head and went to take a bath. I was trying not to think about it anymore. I didn't want to make a lot of noise because it would wake up my wife. Then I could hear someone entering the bathroom. "My love, excuse me for how late it is, but you know that there has been a lot of work in the office." She did not answer me. Whenever she got angry, she didn't want to talk to me. "How was your day?" I asked her, but I did not receive an answer, and when I tried to peek through the curtain, I could see the silhouette of another person, much smaller in size compared to my wife. I stayed silent for a moment. Something inside me told me not to open the curtains. And that's when I heard someone bouncing a ball in the bathroom. This caused a shock in me that completely shook my soul. I inevitably remembered the boy, and his voice echoed again in my head. Without thinking, the first thing I did was shout my wife's name several times, and she immediately opened the door. I was already on the floor of the shower when she opened the curtain. I told her what had happened to me the previous nights, including the feeling of guilt I had for having left the poor child alone in the cemetery. She told me that it could be several things, from a lot of stress or something abnormal that was happening, and the latter was what worried her the most. She asked me to take a day off, since it was necessary for us to seek help since she feared the worst. The next day when I got up, I had the feeling that I hadn't rested at all. I felt like I hadn't slept. Even my back hurt a lot. A couple of hours later, we were looking for the home of one of my wife's friends. Even without knowing what my wife intended, she took me to a lower middle-class neighborhood. Sitting on the porch of a house was an elderly woman who immediately recognized my wife and invited us to come in. My wife spoke with her for several minutes. I just looked at them strangely. I still had the grinding sensation in my back, and I felt without energy. I hadn't realized that the lady and my wife had already finished talking, and when I realized, the lady was watching me. That child you saw in the cemetery can be two things, either the spirit of a child who got stuck, or a demon that tries to get closer to you. This last thing she said surprised me. The child did not seem to be a demon. However, the lady explained to me that demons like to look like children to attract their prey more easily. He prepared a series of incense and perfumes for us, which he asked us to sprinkle throughout the house, and especially on me. She told me that perhaps because I passed so many times in front of the cemetery for the souls who were there, I was already someone familiar, and that in some way I attracted them to me. Also that if it turned out to be a demon, that could explain the lack of energy I had. I'll be honest, it was difficult for me to believe her, and when I paid her I felt like I was wasting my money and that I was being scammed, but my wife seemed very convinced, and from my own experience I decided to never question her about the decisions she made for the good of both. Arriving home, my wife began to spray the perfume following the instructions she had given us, and although I had a hard time believing that what she gave us would help me, I did it anyway just to support my wife. It's strange because as I did it, that feeling of heaviness on my shoulders decreased. I felt better and better when we finished the whole house. I felt revitalized. To conclude, my wife asked me to light a candle for that child. In case it was the spirit stuck in our world, maybe it was looking for some light. We put it right in the patio, a place where we had not sprayed that perfume. Before I knew it, a couple of hours had passed. It was already getting dark. I went to check the candle, and it still had a lot of wax. I estimated that it would last until the next morning. But it didn't take long for something to catch my attention. The sound of a constant tapping woke me up. I heard it in the distance. I had no choice but to get up and go investigate. I looked at the time, and it was already past midnight. I could hear that constant tapping, just as if someone was bouncing a ball. It was there that I noticed that sound. It seemed so familiar to me. I quickly went to the window that faces the patio of the house and looked out. There I could see the boy in front of the nightstand, and his ball had stopped bouncing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I remember well that everything was silent and very cold. I could see my breath coming out of my mouth and fogging up the glass, which made me clean the glass with my pajama sleeve because of how foggy it was. This caused a slight squeal when rubbing. The child immediately turned to where I was. Without thinking, I quickly ran into the room with my wife and covered myself completely with the blanket. While I was lying in my bed, I started thinking about thousands of things, which only increased my anxiety more. I didn't know if the boy had managed to see me or if what we did with the perfumes had worked, and I began to hear that familiar tapping approach little by little. That ball was approaching our room. I scolded myself because I had not closed the door. I had only gotten into bed to cover myself, so I thought about waking up my wife to warn her that the child was approaching, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wake her up. I heard someone say on the side of my bed.
Hello.
That voice completely chilled me. It was right next to me. I stopped moving for a moment, pretending to be asleep, and at the same time praying for this to end. A few seconds passed that I felt like they were minutes. The atmosphere felt frozen again, but I didn't know if the child had already left. I uncovered the blanket a little and managed to see his silhouette still standing next to me. He was expecting something from me, and that's why he would still be there next to me. So I gathered my courage and answered him. "You need something?" I asked him in a very low voice, but did not receive any response. Then I began to feel someone's hand rest on my head. It was a small hand. That pressure on my head caused a shiver in me that, after a second, went away, taking everything with him. The atmosphere no longer felt so cold, and to tell the truth, I no longer felt afraid. I uncovered my head and opened my eyes. There was no one anymore. My wife woke up at that moment and noticed that I was completely drenched in sweat. She asked me if I was okay, and I told her everything that had happened. Quickly, she went to the patio and returned with the candle in hand. The candle was completely consumed. He needed a lot of light and perhaps someone to listen to him. That was what my wife told me. After a couple of hours, we went back to sleep, and I don't know what happened. That night, I had a kind of nightmare in which I could see that a child was playing near a park, and his ball had gone in the middle of the street. Without realizing it, a car had hit him. The next day, my wife asked me to buy more candles and put them in the yard in case the child came back. I never saw him again since that last experience I had. I never saw the boy or heard the ball again. However, when I get to work and park in front of the cemetery, I inevitably think about him. Nowadays, it has still taken me some work to get used to this memory. I still insist that everything that happens maintains a logic, but there are situations that make you change your mind completely.